Forces as Operation Desert Storm rolls north through Kuwait and into Iraq, well ahead of schedule and expectations.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, America at war. Reporting from Saudi Arabia, Tom Brokaw with Garrick Utley in New York.
Good evening. It is one of the largest military operations in modern history, and if the early patterns hold, it will be a very short war and a very complete victory. Operation Desert Storm tonight, rolling through and sealing off Iraqi positions in Kuwait and in Iraq. Almost no opposition. The biggest problem in the early hours, the thousands of Iraqis who have surrendered. There was so little resistance from most units, they made better time racing across the desert than most American commuters during rush hour. This is the 2nd Marine Division, and it rounded up hundreds of Iraqi prisoners as it headed north. NBC's Rick Davis was with the 101st Airborne when it invaded Iraq.
2,000 members of the 101st Airborne landed by helicopter 70 miles inside Iraq. They carried with them a wide arsenal of weapons, including vehicles mounted with TOW missiles. Another 2,000 members of the 101st Airborne and a massive array of weapons are on their way by road, punching their way north. They are, at this point, behind the Revolutionary Guards. They are doing so well that they're running into very little opposition, and those they are meeting are surrendering.
The 18th Army Artillery invaded Iraq as well, sending round after round into enemy positions. Young American gunners were eager to complete the battle.
We had to go kill people, but that's the only way we're getting home. I see it's either them or me.
The big guns of the USS Missouri, a holdover from World War II, were hard at work from the sea, concentrating on the Kuwaiti coastline. The third leg of the air-land-sea battle plan. F-16 attack planes which flew close air support for the troops on the ground. One Marine plane was reported lost today. Saddam Hussein did try another Scud attack on the Saudi capital of Riyadh, and again, the Patriots successfully intercepted. Along the road to Kuwait City, it looks as if the battle has been going on for days, not hours. The destruction is so complete. American military commanders caution the toughest fighting is yet to come. But tonight, they're well ahead of schedule and keeping the pressure on Saddam Hussein.
I would hope that the son of a gun would wake up and smell the coffee, frankly, but we'll just have to wait and see.
We want to remind you that official details are tightly held by the military. We do not yet have a complete list of American casualties, for example, but based on what we know, based on the early going, if it continues in this fashion, and there is no guarantee that it will, but if it does continue in this fashion, it will be a triumph of historic proportions for President Bush and for the American military. NBC's John Cochran is at the White House tonight, and Fred Francis is at the Pentagon. Fred, Iraq promised the mother of all battles, and now it appears that it's about to become an orphan. Let's go to John Cochran and find out what the president is thinking about all of this tonight. John?
Tom, the president has just received a briefing, a military briefing, after which he was described as very gratified by the initial successes. But he was also obviously concerned that American casualties are starting to increase. Having urged other Americans to pray for Allied forces, Mr. Bush did the same at the Episcopal church known as the Church of Presidents, St. John's, just a block from the White House. During the service, the President and Mrs. Bush could hear anti-war protesters pounding drums. As the Bushes left, police moved in to arrest a demonstrator, one of several arrested near the White House. But the President knows overall support for the war is strong. What happens after the war is uncertain. Who, for example, protects Kuwait after the Iraqis are expelled? On Meet the Press, Bush's national security advisor said, this is one job that can be done without Americans.
Certainly, we must have a force around the borders of Kuwait in order to preserve the security of that state. But that might very well be able to be done by Arab forces.
Today, the Soviets criticized Bush for turning down Moscow's request to delay the attack a day or two. U.S. officials say new reports of atrocities by Iraq forced Bush to move.
It was rounding up and executing Kuwaiti citizens, holding some of them hostages as human shields.
And the big question, what does the future hold for Saddam Hussein?
Assuming that he suffers a crushing defeat, does this lower the chances that Saddam can survive politically?
Hopefully.
More than hopefully?
I think the result will be an Iraq with seriously diminished military capability, but still with some defensive capability.
U.S. officials tell NBC News they would not be surprised if the Emir of Kuwait is back in his homeland tomorrow, Kuwait's National Day, the Kuwaiti equivalent of July 4th. Tom?
Thank you, John Cochran at the White House, the residence of the Commander-in-Chief. Now let's go across the Potomac to the Pentagon and NBC's Fred Francis, who has the military equation for us tonight. And Fred, what did happen to the Iraqis?
Well, Tom, the first battle reports received here in Washington made it seem as if the Iraqi army was observing a curfew. Few of the Iraqis came out to fight, and most of those who did surrendered quickly. The Allied assault, a long-planned combination of deep strikes with high speed and heavy firepower, was going so well by this morning that the President was told by Defense Secretary Cheney and General Colin Powell to expect only 3 or 4 days of heavy fighting.
The resistance has been light all across the front. The breaching operations have been successful. The casualties, fortunately, have been extremely light, as Norm said. One of the big problems we've been faced with are just dealing with all of the prisoners that are coming south.
Other officials said there were fewer than a dozen American casualties in the first 12 hours. But NBC News has been told those figures are now much higher. The first American, British, and French tanks crossed into Iraq early yesterday afternoon. They were 40 miles into Iraq without significant opposition and, said one senior official, would roll 100 miles deep into southern Iraq before turning south to control a large slice of Iraq and confront Saddam's battered Republican guards.
We have no interest in occupying Iraq, but we've also said that there won't be any sanctuary inside Iraq for those forces that have been involved in occupying Kuwait.
With the largest armored columns in the north, American and Allied forces in the south are in the process of splitting much of occupied Kuwait into battle zones to encircle Saddam's forces in several areas and block them with thousands of troops flown into southern Iraq by helicopter. The overall goal is to form a buffer zone on Kuwait's northern flank, from Basra to the Saudi border, to prevent a retreat. Well, Tom, that is the military goal. The political goal is to destroy or capture the army which keeps Saddam in power, to be able to craft the terms of the peace in the wake of Iraq's defeat. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis at the Pentagon. Baghdad Radio tonight broadcast a speech from Saddam Hussein, what's left of his troops in the field, and he said, "Fight them in the style of the faithful men. They are the camp of atheism, hypocrisy, and treachery." And Iraq then went on to claim that it, in fact, is winning the war. Our nightly news continues in a moment. Gary Cutley in New York and NBC's Tom Aspel in Baghdad.
If you were in Iraq today listening to Baghdad Radio, it would sound like a different war, a totally different one, a war in which Iraqi forces are repelling the American and Allied attacks and inflicting casualties, heavy casualties. It may not be the truth at all, but it is the news in Baghdad tonight, and Tom Aspel is there.
Right after dark, Baghdad was attacked again from the air. A reminder to the city that even though the ground war may be 400 miles to the south, the air war is still very much a danger. Throughout the day, Iraqis had listened for news of their army's progress against the offensive from the U.S. and its allies. 6 hours after the attack began, Saddam Hussein spoke on Baghdad radio. Bush and Fahd of Saudi Arabia have stabbed us in the back, he said, but God is on the side of Iraq. He told his people to fight with every means at their disposal and promised victory over the invaders. Official military communiques began mentioning the ground war after midday. The first, issued by the Iraqi High Command, spoke of attacks on 6 Iraqi divisions in the Southern War Theater and said that the Iraqi forces were holding and inflicting heavy casualties on the Allied forces. A second communique, read out over the radio just after dark here, denied Allied reports that U.S. Marines had captured the island of Failaka off the Kuwaiti coast and challenged the Americans to provide proof of their battle claims. Here in Baghdad, Iraqis are paying close attention to news of the battle on their radios. There's hardly a family in the capital which doesn't have a man at the front. They feel their country's future now hangs in the balance. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Baghdad.
The Gulf crisis and now the war itself have divided the Arab world. Egypt and Syria side with the United States and its allies and have committed their troops. On the other side, Arabs who chose to side with Saddam Hussein. For them, tonight is a time for a painful reappraisal, or perhaps just for frustration and anger. An example, Jordan. Dennis Murphy is in Amman tonight. Dennis?
Garrick, it's very near time now to sort out winners and losers in the Arab world. Jordan seems dazed by it all. Most people here realize Saddam is being crushed, and they're in the losers' corner. 50 women chanted outside the U.S. Embassy here today. American citizens were advised to stay at home and exercise extreme caution. The Arabic newspapers condemned the United States for brushing off the last-minute Iraqi offer to withdraw from Kuwait. George Bush is a hated man on some streets here.
Tell this guy to get out of here. This is our land.
There was little news of the war itself. The streets were mostly quiet.
People are stunned by the sudden change, and they're worried and confused and hopeful.
In the Palestinian refugee camps, the radio announced the official government reaction to the ground war. Anger, sorrow, condemnation.
We are still insisting that a ceasefire is something that should be sought, that bloodshed should stop.
Worshippers at Amman's Anglican church tonight were asked to pray for peace.
Perfect forgiveness.
At a local mosque, this man said he prayed for Iraq's victory. In Yemen today, thousands took to the street to chant for Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Yemen, like Jordan, like Algeria, stands to lose big with the Arab states supporting the allies. Egypt's President Hosni Mubarak was asked today if Saddam should be removed from power.
I have said this very clearly. I cannot work with him. I never trust this man.
Trust. When the war is over, the Arab states will find themselves looking at one another across a huge rift, the divide between winners and losers of the Gulf War. Garrick?
Thank you, Dennis Murphy in Amman. And we'll have more news as the ground offensive rolls ahead this evening. One frustrated bystander is in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Although he has supported the UN resolutions, the Soviets have had no role in the war and no success in their diplomatic efforts to prevent it. So all they can do now is watch. In Moscow, Bob Abernathy with the Kremlin reaction.
At the Kremlin, deep disappointment over the ground attack and formal regret that diplomacy had not worked.
The instinct to rely on a military solution prevailed.
After last week's intensive negotiations, today's statement said the differences between what Iraq had accepted and what other countries wanted were not too wide.
The Soviet Union expresses regret that a most realistic chance to secure a peaceful outcome has been passed up.
The official view here is that the U.S.-Soviet alliance is solid, but the personal relationship between Presidents Bush and Gorbachev may have been strained. Bush never told Gorbachev in advance the attack was on. Today, the often hardline Soviet news agency TASS said prospects for a settlement of the crisis have been seriously complicated. It went on, American troops are visibly rubbing their hands in expectation of the chance to crush the Iraqis completely. Gorbachev's support of the anti-Iraq coalition is unpopular with the resurgent right wing here, 100,000 of whom turned out yesterday to honor the Soviet military. Soviet conservatives are uneasy about a major war just across their southern border, where Soviet air defense forces are now on high alert. Gorbachev must also be careful not to offend the 50 million Soviet Muslims to whom Iraqis are already appealing for support. Meanwhile, another huge demonstration today by reformers who backed Gorbachev's principal rival, Boris Yeltsin. Beside the Kremlin walls, the crowd chanted, "Gorbachev, resign."
With all these pressures, today's official statement criticizing the ground attack was perhaps as mild as was politically possible. It suggests a strain, but not a break, in U.S.-Soviet cooperation. Bob Abernethy, NBC News, Moscow.
And we can be sure that the Soviets will be back in the Middle East looking for political influence when this war is over. Tom?
Thank you, Garrick. It's been almost 5 decades since the world has seen a ground war on the scale of the one that is taking place here in the Persian Gulf. And that was World War II. The battlefield was Europe. NBC's Keith Miller tonight in London with a reaction from Europe to the war now in the Persian Gulf.
Good evening, Tom. European leaders of allied nations expressed confidence that the war would be won, but they cautioned against thinking the worst is over.
As a nation, we are rightly proud of our armed forces.
From Buckingham Palace, a wartime broadcast, unprecedented for Queen Elizabeth II, who praised British troops.
I hope that we can unite in praying that their success will be as swift as it is certain, and that it may be achieved with a smaller cost in human life and suffering as possible.
Prime Minister John Major, following a conversation with President Bush, appeared pleased by news from the front.
It may well be tougher in days to come, though the beginning has been as satisfactory as we could have hoped.
Appearing on French television, President Francois Mitterrand said Saddam Hussein was getting the battle he wanted, but would lose Kuwait. There is still the fear of terrorist attacks in Europe. All American military installations are on maximum alert. Denouncing the war, tens of thousands of people marched in Spain. People demonstrated in Madrid and Barcelona. Some chanted slogans against the United States. Speaking from the Vatican, Pope John Paul urged people to work and pray for the war to end as quickly as possible. Tonight in London, 100 anti-war activists held a lonely vigil outside the Church of St. Martin's in the Field.
The overwhelming sentiment all across Europe today was for a quick war that may help limit the casualties, pain, and grief that accompany combat. Tom?
Thank you. Keith Miller in London tonight.
Except for a couple of close rounds, it went pretty well.
Is everybody okay? One of those close calls was with an Iraqi mine, disabling a vehicle and injuring one Marine.
Yes, I'm very fortunate. It's scary. It was a scary feeling, and I just stopped shaking a few minutes ago.
But perhaps the most striking scenes of this first day of the ground war were the endless lines of enemy prisoners of war, thousands of them, marching with their hands over their heads, silhouetted against the burning oil fields, torched when it became clear their days in Kuwait were numbered. As the prisoners marched to the rear, the Allied forces surged forward.
With the exception of one early afternoon engagement between the Marine Task Force and an Iraqi armor unit, contact with the enemy can best be characterized as light.
The Iraqis did manage to launch one Scud missile toward the Saudi capital of Riyadh. Once again, American Patriots launched to intercept scored a direct hit. While some experts predict final victory in a matter of days, Allied commanders merely say their assault is right on schedule, having met all its goals for the first 24 hours. But its toughest challenge may still lie ahead. Iraq's Republican Guard, its best fighting force, considered by many to be Saddam's last hope. Jay Levine, Channel 2 News in Saudi Arabia.
Cameras are being... war were shown stripped, tied, or lying where they were attacked or injured. Soldiers fired their weapons into Iraqi bunkers just to make sure there were no holdouts. The Saudis say they also encountered little resistance from the Iraqis. What they did encounter were a lot of white flags. The U.S. says so many Iraqis are surrendering that it could bog down the operation. In Baghdad, a huge Allied bomb exploded at the exact moment the deadline passed for Iraq to begin withdrawing its troops from Kuwait. Since then, there have been non-stop bombings in what's described as a massive air war. Residents of the Iraqi capital huddled in shelters. Baghdad was burning. By the light of morning, many were glued to their radios. A short time later, Saddam Hussein confirmed what some residents
said to be very pleased about the progress of the war. After attending church services this morning, the president met with his top advisors, including Defense Secretary Cheney. Cheney apparently briefed Mr. Bush in great detail.
Running right over the other. My colleague Dan Rather is in Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, Mike. The fast-break Allied ground offensive is through day one. U.S. Marine infantry and armor streaked across the desert into Kuwait, hammering 40 miles deep. passing burning oil wells and abandoned bunkers. Allied forces surround Kuwait City now, with some parachutists reportedly already inside. The U.S. Army was sweeping deep into southern Iraq. The 101st Airborne, 40 miles inside, driving for the Euphrates River and envelopment of the Republican Guard. American casualties officially reported extremely low, approximately 12 killed, all of them Marines. Allied troops seized thousands of Iraqi soldiers. The prisoners of war formed a long, grim line through the desert. Many of the Iraqi prisoners were battered and blooded and frightened. U.S. officials are surprised at the vast number of Iraqis surrendering, and they express concern that they may not be able to handle them all. Now, while the ground war raged, so did the air war. Allied planes again bombs away over Baghdad, and Iraq, defiant, hurled a Scud at Saudi Arabia. U.S. Patriot missiles took off, hit, and obliterated the Scud in a spectacular strike. See the combat, two main battlefields, one in southern Iraq, where the U.S. Army is focused, and the other near the Persian Gulf, where the Marines are doing most of the work. Eric Ingberg has more on what's happening inside Kuwait.
Dan, it was thought that one of the most difficult jobs the Marines would confront in the land battle would be surging into the minefields that Iraq's army has placed in their infamous Saddam line along the border. As the Marines stormed the border, they discovered to their amazement they had not considered one problem: that Iraqis rushing to surrender would stop some Marines in their tracks in the narrow passages through the minefields. Thousands of enemy gave up without a fight, just as the U.S. command had expected. The weeks of aerial bombardment had left their morale, in the words of one Marine, about as high as a boot. In the earlier thrusts across the Kuwait border, Saudi soldiers found a weakened, demoralized enemy too. The Allied forces have built encampments for the enemy prisoners, now known officially as EPWs, not POWs. After paperwork and interrogation by intelligence officers, the Iraqis will be turned over to the Saudi military. The only problem the Americans and their allies are having now is too many surrenders. Marine commanders complained all day they didn't have enough time or manpower to handle the prisoners. As they pushed deeper into Kuwait, the Marines said that they were using every available truck to handle the prisoners' flood. Right now, said one Marine officer of the Iraqis who want to quit, we're outnumbered. Dan?
Eric, can things be going as well as they seem to be?
Well, one Marine commander said that the takeover of all of Kuwait would now be a matter of hours and not days.
That leaves it up to the Republican Guard. U.S. commanders believe the Republican Guard is in a hopeless situation. If they stay where they are, they get hammered into oblivion. If they come into the open desert, they get cut to ribbons. If they retreat into Basra, they'll be encircled. If the commanders, if they are right about that, the war could be over in a matter of days. It's hold your breath time, Mike.
Dan, with smoke from a night of bombing still hanging in the air, Baghdad appeared to be going about its business as usual today. There seems to be nothing in these censored pictures to suggest heightened tension. CBS News correspondent Betsy Aaron is in Baghdad tonight, and we asked her about the mood there as word spread that the ground war had begun.
There is no joy in Baghdad. This is a city that has been badly bruised by this war so far. Baghdad never suffered this kind of terrible destruction during the 8 years of the Iran-Iraq war. So nobody is joyous here.
Betsy, a short time ago, Morley Safer talked to CBS News military consultant General George Christ about the fighting and what it aims to accomplish.
Well, for Allied forces today, with scores of enemy tanks smashed and thousands of Iraqis captured.
Coalition forces are engaging armor and mech forces with great success. During the late morning and early afternoon today, Marines engaged an armor and mech force destroying 50 to 60 tanks.
U.S. and French troops moved into Kuwait. However, one U.S. official said it's going to be a while before the Allies retake Kuwait City. The most decisive battle of the war thus far was on the Iraqi-Kuwait border. Allied forces reportedly fighting well against Iraq's elite Republican Guard. Meantime, more than 20,000 enemy prisoners of war have been rounded up since Saturday. Many of the Iraqi soldiers have surrendered, and Allied commanders are denying that the thousands of POWs are bogging down their offensive. The POWs, they say, appear to be totally demoralized.
There's word tonight that the first local Marine to be killed in the ground war is a 19-year-old man from Corona. And Patrick Healy is standing by now with more on that part of the story. Here's a live report from Corona. Patrick?
Keith and Kelly, his name is Adam Hogue, and it seems like everybody in this Corona neighborhood knew Adam Hogue is a good kid, quiet and earnest. Adam Hogue, only 19, private first class in the U.S. Marines. Adam Hogue confirmed by the Pentagon as one of 4 casualties, one of 4 deaths in the ground invasion in the combat that began on Saturday. Adam Hogue served in the Marines' 1st Expeditionary Brigade out of Camp Pendleton, and he entered the Marines a year ago, January, we are told. He was later based out of Hawaii. Adam Hogue. In his neighborhood, where he lived, where he grew up, U.S. flags and yellow ribbons set a patriotic, if somber tone.
Out of Corona and Norco for a while, I guess. He didn't have nothing, he said, here to look forward to or know what to do, so wanted to try something different.
Best friend Sean Gasper said that Adam Hogue had been inspired by an uncle who had served in Vietnam, was a veteran. Adam Hogue, casualty of the ground war, young man from Corona. He was only 19. Reporting live, Patrick Healy, Channel 4 News in Corona. Keith and Kelly, back to you.
All right, Patrick, thank you very much for that. And word that Saddam Hussein had ordered a pullout brought this reaction from military wives near Camp Pendleton today.
I hope it's true. I really do. I'd like for it to be over so we can all have all our guys come home.
My husband's been gone. He'll be gone 9 months next month. I'm ready for him to come home. I'm ready for Hussein to go home and stay home.
And it didn't take long for that news to spread through downtown Oceanside. A lot of people who live here have friends and relatives in the Persian Gulf, and since January, they've been bolstering each other while waiting.
On the second day of the ground war, Saddam Hussein orders a withdrawal of his troops, but first he gets revenge. 12 Americans killed, 40 are missing in a Scud missile attack.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, America at war. Reporting from Saudi Arabia, Tom Brokaw with Jane Pauley in New York.
Good evening from Saudi Arabia. It is a night of desperation from Baghdad, a night of triumph for Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait and Iraq. And here in Saudi Arabia, it is a night of tragedy for 12 American Army reservists killed in a Scud missile attack, and 40 others are missing. That Scud missile attack came about 5 hours before Saddam Hussein announced on Baghdad radio that he was prepared to withdraw his troops from Kuwait under the provisions of the Soviet peace plan. Will that fly with the American military command and with President Bush? Standing by now at the White House, NBC's John Cochran, at the Pentagon, Fred Francis. Fred, if they begin the withdrawal, will they have safe passage?
No, they will not have safe passage, Tom. Under previously dictated policy by this administration, they have to leave their equipment in place at this point if they want to withdraw. One senior official told NBC News a short time ago, remember Khafji. In Khafji, that battle for the coastal city, Tom, the Iraqi tanks came in with their turrets turned backwards, the universal signal for withdrawal or retreat or surrender, and they turned around and fired. So any tanks moving north are going to move north into more than 100,000 American and Allied troops, because that is roughly the number which is who have taken up positions in southern Iraq. As a matter of fact, Tom, American and Allied troops are within 150 miles of Baghdad. They have no intention of going to Baghdad right now, but they are a blocking force, not just a blocking force for troops coming down from Baghdad, but they can block a retreat anytime they like. Tom?
John Cochran, what's the reaction at the White House from a political point of view? Is President Bush prepared to accept this?
He is not prepared to accept this. First, let me say that there are intelligence reports indicating that, in fact, the Iraqi tanks are headed north. The problem is, on their way to the Iraqi border to get through Kuwait, they've got to go past American positions. They're very concerned within the administration what will happen when those Iraqi tanks, even if they are trying to retreat, and it's not sure why they're headed north, but you'd think if they're headed north that they're retreating, what happens when they run across those American forces? So we will continue to attack them because we don't want these people, obviously, to have their firepower when they run across across the American troops. President Bush received word of this news that the Iraqis were going to withdraw, or said they would withdraw. This word from Baghdad radio. He received it on Capitol Hill, where he was engaged in a game of paddleball. This was just about a half an hour ago. Short time ago, however, Bush's spokesman Marlon Fitzwater said, "We have not received news of the Iraqi withdrawal from an authoritative source. Therefore, the war goes on."
John Cochran, do they see this as another card for the Soviet Union? Gorbachev has been trying hard to keep his Soviet peace plan alive, even going to the United Nations.
Well, the Soviets were up to their elbows this afternoon. They again were trying to advance a new peace initiative, some of the details of which are unclear. The Soviets were talking about reaching a new date for withdrawal. Part of the problem is the White House is saying that the way that the Iraqis should retreat is to have this announced at the UN, that the Iraqi ambassador to the UN should make the announcement, should inform the UN Security Council. However, we're not sure that the Iraqi ambassador has communications to Baghdad, Tom. It's not clear he could announce that if he wanted to.
And Fred Francis of the Pentagon, final thoughts before we move along here?
Tom, Baghdad has almost no communications with its troops in the field. Today, U.S. intelligence intercepted communications from Iraqi commanders pleading with Baghdad to allow them to retreat. The communication said at least 7 Iraqi divisions could no longer fight. So that was in the clear, picked up by U.S. officials. So indeed, the Iraqi army is in terrible shape. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis, and John Cochran. We'll be coming back to both of you as we proceed with this extraordinary evening of developments here in the Persian Gulf. About 5 hours before that announcement on Baghdad radio, there was a Scud missile alert here in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Then the all clear was sounded. We thought that the Patriot missiles had once again executed a successful intercept, but that was not the case. The Scud missile fell on an Army barracks that contained Army reservists. We do not know the unit exactly, but this is what happened. 12 killed, 40 still missing tonight. The missile's warhead, or debris, slammed into the barracks as troops were sitting down to dinner.
The whole thing's gone. Everybody in it is either wounded or dead.
How many people were inside?
About 130 maybe. There's 53 for sure. That was my unit. They're gone.
That was a survivor of tonight's Scud missile attack, the first ever to successfully hit an American target.
One of these ambulances has to go up there. Oh, the people are up here.
About 150 men and women, members of a U.S. military transport company, were living in this former warehouse on the east side of Dhahran. An eyewitness said the victims had no warning.
Split seconds.
Dozens of ambulances, Saudi and American, rushed to the scene. Rescue workers pulled the injured from the wreckage, but some were beyond help. The twisted framework of the warehouse seemed to indicate the warhead scored a direct hit. Hours after the flames were out, emergency teams continued to pick through the debris for more victims. The search is expected to last through the night. There were 12 killed and at least 40 more are missing, and in the ground war, in 2 days of fighting, so far, only 4 Americans have been killed in action. In all of that, these people thought that they were safely out of harm's way. Before the Scud attack, the American commanders from Operation Desert Storm were restrained, but clearly very optimistic about the progress that they are making so far. General Walter Boomer, who is the Marine boss in this theater, said it's not over until it's over, but he predicted that it would be over in a matter of days, not weeks. Vast stretches of the Iraqi and Kuwaiti desert now belong to the Allied forces. U.S. and French troops west of Kuwait moved deeply into Iraq under the protective cover of steady artillery fire. Armor from the 1st Cavalry raced into position to help cut off Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard. In the first 2 days, the assault has been so successful, the greatest problem for the Allies are prisoners, more than 20,000 altogether. These were Saddam's cannon fodder, the green troops on the front lines. This is how they had been living, in crude, disheveled bunkers.
There's a certain element of sympathy for them because they're so poorly equipped, and the way their well-being, they're human beings also, and we're treating them as such, taking as good a care as we can of them.
Those who surrendered were lucky. Many of their Iraqi brothers were killed, and the Army is preparing for thousands more enemy dead.
We'll have to get approval from the theater commander in order to open a mass grave, but in my opinion, that would be the best way to handle it.
As the Allies shell at will, more Allied forces and supplies continue to pour into the war zone. Even those areas that have been secured remain dangerous, however. Active landmines are just off the cleared roadway. And the air over Kuwait is thick with the smoke of battle and burning oil wells, making air support difficult today. American pilots wonder when Saddam Hussein will get the message.
You can bomb him until the cows come home, but until you park your tank on his front lawn, you won't really convince him he's lost the war.
Ground commanders hope that won't be necessary, but American forces are in place just in case. When Nightly News continues in a moment, NBC's Arthur Kent with the action on the front line. Before the ground combat began, there was a lot of talk about the fog of combat. But for the Allied forces, they are moving so swiftly and so easily to their objectives, that fog has not developed. There's only a clear road ahead. NBC's Arthur Kent is one of the journalists assigned to the combat journalism pools.
Rocket batteries fire on distant Iraqi positions, while self-propelled guns pound bunkers just ahead of this armored battalion's rapid advance. This is the 1st Cavalry on the move, well north of the Saudi border. Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Regiment, the Black Knights, presses right up to the Iraqis' collapsing defensive lines. U.S. shells strike home just ahead of Charlie Company's Bradley armored troop carriers, blasting Iraqi bunkers, making certain no opposing troops remain. M1A1 tanks maneuver forward. The 1st Cavalry's armored infantry spreads wide and continues the advance. With attack channels cleared through Iraqi minefields, Charlie Company's vehicles move up, constantly listening by radio for word of what their enemy's troops and tanks are doing on the horizon.
The battalion has held up just short of this burning slit trench, this Iraqi defensive work which has been set alight by A-10 ground attack planes and by long-range artillery. The battalion does not wish to proceed beyond there. There is said to be an Iraqi mechanized unit and dismounted infantry in the open, only 2 kilometers ahead of us from this position.
Once the oil in the trench burns off, the obstacle must be bridged to allow the assault force to cross. Iraqi counterfire has been irregular here, although one of these Apache gunships brought forward to cover the advance has been shot down. Its crew, however, was rescued. The operation, say commanders here, will continue. With the 1st Cavalry, Arthur Kent, NBC News, beyond the Saudi border.
Now to my colleague Jane Pauley in New York with more news about this war. Jane?
Thank you, Tom. Before the Baghdad radio announcement that Saddam Hussein was ready to withdraw his forces from Kuwait, the people of the Iraqi capital were getting a very different story about how the war was progressing. Iraqi military communiques claimed coalition forces fled from the battlefield in utter retreat, and that there was no truth to reports of Iraqi prisoners by the thousands. NBC's Tom Aspel is in Baghdad. His report was monitored by Iraqi sensors.
Thick cloud cover didn't prevent Allied warplanes from attacking Baghdad again tonight. Iraqi anti-aircraft gunners opened up with cannons, reaching for an enemy they could neither see nor hear. The ground war has most people's attention now. Today, Iraqis were told their troops are counter-attacking. The news prompted some to fire in the air in celebration. In a battle lasting 8 hours, the communique said, Iraqi forces destroyed many tanks and pushed the Allied troops back. Communique 63, issued tonight, says Iraqi troops have recaptured all ground lost to the Allies since Sunday. The communiques, broadcast to the people on Baghdad radio, lifted spirits here, however temporarily. The radio station, the main source of information here, seems to have gained new credibility lately. There has been no mention of the large number of Iraqi prisoners the Allies claim to have captured since the beginning of the land battle. But one newspaper, Al Thawra, carried an item this morning encouraging Iraqi soldiers to stand and fight. The only way for a great and steadfast Iraq is military honor and a strong will, it said.
The Iraqis have great faith in their forces in this land battle, not so much to keep Kuwait, but to defend Iraq itself from foreign invaders. Jane?
Tom, do the people believe their forces can actually push the coalition back?
Well, I don't think at this stage that many of them think that they have much of a chance against the technological superiority of the Allied forces in Kuwait. But should the foreign forces enter southern Iraq, then I think we're in for a different story. The Iraqis would feel then that they are defending their homeland, and that would be quite a different matter in spite of all the technology lined up against them. I think they'd fight very hard indeed to defend their own country.
Thank you, Tom. Tom Aspel in Baghdad. In a moment, how the Iraqi troops have been surrounded.
Late word from Baghdad Radio once again tonight. Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz apparently contacted the Soviet ambassador in Baghdad and asked him to convey to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev Saddam Hussein's desire now to withdraw his forces from Kuwait under the Soviet peace plan. That has been roundly rejected, of course, by President Bush and by Allied commanders here. Fred Francis reports from the Pentagon now that even before that announcement from Saddam Hussein tonight, he had many more problems on the battlefield than what we could see. Fred, what's the latest there?
Well, he sure did, Tom. Allied forces are inside 150 miles from Baghdad, and no advances planned on the capital, but the Allies are now in a position all across southern Iraq to block any retreat. And tonight, the most decisive battle of the war is being fought on the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border against Republican Guard tank divisions. Pentagon officials say the early reports from desert fighting in that battle and other fronts were very encouraging. Earlier today, American commanders said they had destroyed 270 Iraqi tanks, 35 of them from the Republican Guards. General Richard Neal reported other battlefield triumphs.
During the late morning and early afternoon today, Marines engaged an armor mech force destroying 50 to 60 tanks. An Army armor brigade operating with Marine forces engaged another armor mech unit consisting of over 150 vehicles.
American, British, and French armored columns from at least 2 Saudi staging areas have now reached key positions in Iraq. American and French paratroopers are a blocking force just 150 miles southwest of Baghdad to counter an Iraqi tank division at Karbala. Another division is southwest of Najib, again deep in Iraq. Closer to Kuwait, a third major unit has joined American Rangers at Nazariya, a critical resupply crossroads on the Euphrates River. Other Allied units will hook south soon to attack into Kuwait from the north. And finally, an Allied tank army is tonight confronting the Republican Guards from the west. The guns of the Army's 24th Mechanized Infantry and other units, according to Pentagon sources, may decide within the next 24 hours how quickly the war will end. Not everything has been wildly successful. These slow-moving American vehicles are reportedly being delayed by what a Pentagon official described as less than aggressive Arab forces. The Arab forces are only a few miles south of Kuwait City and should have entered today. All other thrusts into Kuwait are fast-paced. Only one has met stiff resistance from an Iraqi Army unit held in reserve. But those Iraqi units held in reserve are being attacked by Allied aircraft as soon as they try to form up in battle formation. Today, Allied forces flew more than 500 close air support missions. Tom?
And they did quite well, Fred, even though there was a fair amount of cloud cover here today as well, based on the talks that I had with some of the pilots in this area. Walter Boomer, who is the Marine General in command of the Marines in this area, said it will be over in a matter of days, not weeks. Did he mean by the end of this week?
Yes, he did, Tom. As you well know, there has been no Marine amphibious landing, and there may not be a battle amphibious landing. It's going so well, Tom, they're probably a day or two ahead of schedule. And for once, all U.S. intelligence reports that have fed into this thing for the last couple of weeks have been right, that this would be a very short war with very low casualties. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis of the Pentagon. The last official report, only 4 killed in action so far in the war, but 12 killed in the Scud missile attack.
In Kuwait, the world's richest oil fields are battlefields. Wells by the hundreds have been destroyed and set ablaze. Millions of gallons of oil have been dumped into the Persian Gulf, and yet gasoline prices are dropping. NBC's chief financial correspondent Mike Jensen explains why.
At this station in Los Angeles, gasoline is down to 87.9 cents a gallon.
I love it. It's terrific. I hope it stays this way.
All over America, gas prices are plunging. If it weren't for the higher federal excise tax, gas would be cheaper now than it was before the war. That's because crude oil prices have been falling, and that worries OPEC. 6 non-Arab OPEC ministers met today in Vienna. They want to jack prices up, but they're not likely to succeed. even with this happening in Kuwait.
As of 1300 this afternoon, we can confirm over 600 fires burning. Of these, at least 517 are wellheads.
Kuwait is a huge oil producer, so is Iraq. But the world has gotten along for months without their oil, because Saudi Arabia and others are pumping a lot more oil than usual, and because demand is down with the U.S. recession. The oil glut will get even bigger when Red Adair, the oil well firefighter, starts putting out the fires in Kuwait. He just signed a contract with Kuwait to send in 2 teams as soon as it's safe.
But it's going to take a couple of years at least to do all of this.
Meantime, falling gas prices bode well for the U.S. economy. Motorists have more money for other things.
Even if it's only $50 a month, if they don't do a lot of driving, or $150 a month if they do a lot of driving, it's money in their pocket.
That buying power is exactly what the U.S. economy needs to help it out of the recession. Some economists say the worst is already behind us. Mike Jensen, NBC News, New York.
On Wall Street today, the market...
Iraqis who are surrendering. They have to be bathed and fed and clothed and deloused and put somewhere here in Saudi Arabia. NBC's Jamie Gangel tonight on the military plans for them.
The long line of surrender. For many of these Iraqi soldiers, the march to Saudi Arabia and POW camps is a relief, an end to 40 days of pounding. But for the Allies, it represents a new problem on the battlefield. In 2 days, more than 18,000 Iraqis have been captured. Not a surprise, but at times overwhelming.
Across the front, coalition forces continue to capture large numbers of enemy prisoners of war. In some cases, entire battalions at a time.
To help process POWs on the battlefield and in the rear, record numbers of military police, more than 10,000, 6,500 of them reserves called up for the first time. The Allies say the ground war has not been delayed by the prisoners, but temporary camps have had to be set up at the front.
Yes, we have in theater and moving up with our troops 3 prisoner of war battalions. That is, battalions to take back prisoners of war. It is set out in such a way that we can take them from the front, shuffle them back down the line through brigade collecting points into a divisional prisoner of war cage. So we're pretty well organized on that score.
Pentagon officials say the Allies have been planning for as many as 200,000 POWs. Early reports are the Iraqis have been easy prisoners, relieved to know they will be fed and decently cared for. But with wholesale surrenders, it will be a while. Officials can't or won't say how long before the POWs reach the official camps in Saudi Arabia. They will be kept there until the war is over, when they will be sent back to Iraq.
As one Pentagon official acknowledged, suddenly having tens of thousands of prisoners certainly is a problem. But he said, if you have your choice of problems, this is one you'd take. Jamie Gangel, NBC News, the Pentagon.
Jane, that's nightly news up to the minute. You and I will.
Persian Gulf are engaged in warfare on land, on sea, and in the air. And in all 3 areas, a battle continues with the media.
From this point forward, we must limit what we say.
Just 2 hours after the ground war in the Persian Gulf began, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney summoned reporters to the Pentagon to announce a news blackout citing troop safety. But the blackout only seemed to spur on some reporters.
At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, there was bombardment from every direction.
The first live report from the battlefront came from CBS's Bob McEwen, armed with a portable satellite dish. McEwen had avoided Pentagon restrictions by going off on his own. CBS News Vice President Joe Paranen.
The Pentagon did not call us to protest. However, I heard that they were rather amazed at Bob McEwen's report.
ABC's Forrest Sawyer also broke from pool reporters and got to the front to provide the first live pictures of the ground assault, an Egyptian armored unit preparing for battle.
We're in the way of a tank, and I'll just keep talking with you if you don't mind.
You can photograph
through the night. Pardon me?
Can you photograph the tank or not?
But Sunday morning, the short-lived news blackout ended with General Norman Schwarzkopf's televised briefing. Some analysts believe it was not because of network pressure for information, but because the news was good.
It begins to look like the military feared there would be some very difficult fighting in the early stages and that America would suffer a lot of casualties. Then when we didn't, suddenly they were willing to talk again.
You can see a little better than I can with this night scope that we have set up, Peter.
With 28 network pool crews on the battlefields and from those looking for scoops like Sawyer, footage is expected to flow as long as the news remains good.
The American people are not being permitted to see and hear the full story.
And while others say the information should always flow, like Walter Cronkite did before a congressional committee last week, some viewers are not so sure. The fear is the media giving away military secrets.
We've had some phone calls complaining that we are giving away military secrets. I assure you we are not.
Today in the Persian Gulf, it was back to normal without a media blackout. There was a military...
Abandoned recoilless rifles and fired sniper rounds into the bunkers to see if they were occupied. But one or two Iraqi shells did fall among the serried ranks of Saudi armored vehicles. Then at mid-morning, the tanks rolled north again, only to be halted when they encountered some accurate Iraqi artillery fire. The artillery duel got hotter. Shells were falling uncomfortably close now among the Saudi tanks and personnel carriers, forcing them to make a minor tactical withdrawal. For the time being, the ground offensive in this particular area was stalled. Then they brought up the heavy stuff, the multiple-barreled rocket launchers that can put down a lethal barrage of tons of high explosive in a few seconds. The battle goes on.
For Marines of the 1st Division, the objective was to head due north across the Saudi border and run directly at Kuwait City. They did so with relative ease, meeting minimal resistance, and today we're moving into positions on the outskirts of the Kuwaiti capital. The 2nd Division Marines advanced alongside the 1st. They passed abandoned Iraqi bunkers on the way north, and like the 1st, sparred only briefly with the enemy. Those who were wounded were evacuated by helicopter, soon to be airlifted to hospitals back in Saudi Arabia. By nightfall, the 2nd Division also had closed in on Kuwait City, joining a tightening circle of Allied forces with the aim of completely surrounding the Iraqis.
Kuwait City, we're moving towards Kuwait City, and we continue to experience success as we move in that direction.
To the east of Kuwait City, in the northern Persian Gulf, Marine and naval forces positioned themselves offshore, well within striking distance. The USS Nassau and 20 other ships made up the amphibious task force. Their mere presence made them an integral part of the battle plan. Major General Harry Jenkins is commander of the Marine Landing Force in the Gulf.
Well, keep in mind, the idea is to, and keep in mind the number of Iraqi units we have tied down on the coasts, and as long as they're watching the coast and they're not engaging our units that are working in Kuwait now and further west. So there again is the viability of the amphibious assault or the presence out here that we're prepared to go in to do anything if General Schwarzkopf wants us to do it.
The Naval Task Force is equipped with an air attack that has charged the Kuwaiti coast only to return to ship. It's to make the Iraqis think an amphibious assault has begun. In the meantime, the U.S. flotilla will continue mine-clearing operations, cutting lanes toward the beach in case an assault is ordered. At today's Allied briefing in Riyadh, British Commander John Teague proudly announced that one of his ships had successfully fended off a Silkworm missile attack against the Naval Task Force.
Whilst it can only be conjecture as to exactly who was the target, clearly the 500 kilograms of warhead inside the Silkworm could well have caused considerable, if not fatal damage to its target. And there's certainly one ship out there at present who has good reason to be thankful to the alert radarman on board HMS Gloucester.
The Saudi commander announced the one bit of bad news at the briefing: indiscriminate attacks against civilians in Kuwait City.
There is horrible things going on. I hate to say it, but there is killing people by axes, hitting both heads. They rape females, cut them, certain parts of them, and hang them in every street. There is, unfortunately, they even try to force their own Iraqi very young soldiers to kill another Kuwaiti children, those type of things, which is, if I elaborate in it, it's so horrible.
But General Neal said those atrocities would not affect the coalition's battle plan.
We're ahead of schedule, as I told you, and I think that we're going to deal with that situation as we come upon it, but to try and do something specific and change the plan that might either put at risk U.S. or coalition forces, that would not be prudent planning by military commanders.
There are at least an additional 22 dead Americans tonight who offer silent testimony to the intentions of Saddam Hussein. The statement out of Baghdad today says that Saddam Hussein's forces will fight their way out while retreating. We will not attack unarmed soldiers in retreat, but we will consider retreating combat units as a movement of war. The only way Saddam Hussein can persuade the coalition of the seriousness of his intentions would be for him personally and publicly to agree to the terms of the proposal we issued on February 22. And because the announcement from Baghdad referred to the Soviet initiative, he must personally and publicly accept explicitly all relevant UN Security Council resolutions, including especially UN Security Council Resolution 662, which calls for Iraqi rescission of its purported annexation of Kuwait, and UN Security Council Resolution 674, which calls for Iraqi compensation to Kuwait and others. That's the end of the statement. I might just add that the President met with his national security advisors for approximately an hour and 15 minutes this evening to consider this matter, and the President has returned to his residence. Wyatt?
Marlon, any word from Mikhail Gorbachev? Has he called the President and personally asked for a ceasefire?
We've not had any contact with President Gorbachev, although we have had contact with Soviet officials here in their embassy.
The nature of which
Helen?
is what, please? Marlon, the nature of which is what?
To simply inform them of our statement and to discuss the situation as it exists. Helen?
Do you consider the 12 UN resolutions and your February 22 plan as two separate entities that both have to be accepted?
As we explained on Friday, the terms of the February 22 plan, that's the one we disclosed on Friday, was a way of setting criteria for judging the 12 UN resolutions. So it is our judgment that he must still comply with the 12 UN resolutions, and the terms that set forth Friday simply give those detail.
Were those approved by the UN, the criteria, the terms of this whole?
They are the coalition's terms for describing and explaining the UN Security Council resolutions. Brett?
You have now added the condition that Saddam must do this personally. Why have you added that?
We have added this because of the nature of the Baghdad radio statement today, because of the many broken promises of Saddam Hussein, because he has not responded today concerning this withdrawal either directly to us or to the United Nations, and yet he tries or he purports to be interested in a withdrawal. And our attitude is, if that is the case, we ask him to be upfront publicly and let the whole world know exactly what his intentions are. Pascal?
What do you think Saddam Hussein is trying to do by announcing such a withdrawal?
We have no way of judging his motives. Michael?
As we understand it, the UN Security Council is meeting now or will be meeting shortly. But you're out here rejecting this Baghdad radio offer. What do you know about what they're going to be doing in that meeting that leads you to believe you can come out now and reject it?
We aren't rejecting anything. We don't know that there is a genuine offer. We see no evidence of it on the ground. We have no reason to believe the radio report. What we are saying is we hope it's true. We want him to get out, and this is a way to do it. John?
Marlon, if the Iraq's UN ambassador accepts the resolution calling for withdrawal from Kuwait and announces an Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait, will the U.S. continue to attack?
The ground rules are very clear here. We are not going to attack retreating forces. They should lay down their arms and leave, and they wouldn't have to worry about that. But if they're moving as a combat units, they are still subject to the rules of war. Karen?
Yes. Can you tell us whether there's been any sign of Iraqi troops withdrawing, either with their weapons or without them?
We have no indication that there's any withdrawal taking place. John?
Two things about this withdrawal. It sounds like, one, what you're concerned about is these people possibly taking their weapons back into Iraq and being a threat from Iraq. And two, how will these people retreat without their weapons? Some of these people would be in tanks. That's how they travel, right?
They laying down their arms is simply they simply walk out. The fact is, the United States has enormous numbers of troops in that area. The coalition forces are spread throughout the country and throughout Kuwait, and we cannot sacrifice the safety of coalition forces by allowing them to have their weapons and, in effect, fight their way out, whatever that means.
You literally mean walk? You're talking about armored personnel carrier. I mean, personal carrier.
Well, I don't think it needs a definition. I think lay down your arms is pretty clear. Patrick?
How close are we to winning this war so that any UN action might be considered moot?
Well, we are making good progress, but we certainly could not predict an end of the war at this time. Final question, Tom.
Any fashion stalling the UN action, no marling, trying to see if we can win a decisive victory?
No, the UN, as I understand